October 16, 1972. A twin-engine Cessna 310C slices through the frigid Alaskan air, a tiny metal shell against a backdrop of immense, unforgiving wilderness. The aircraft, registration number M1812H, departed from Anchorage, its destination the state capital of Juneau, a routine flight for its experienced pilot. The weather is not ideal, a mix of rain, snow, and low-level turbulence, but it's nothing that should ground a capable pilot and a sturdy aircraft. The flight path cuts across some of the most remote and rugged terrain in North America, a landscape of towering mountains, dense forests, and deep, icy fjords. On board are 4 men. The pilot, Don Jones, a 38-year-old veteran with thousands of flight hours. Beside him is Russell Brown, a trusted aide. In the back sit 2 congressmen, Nick Begich, Alaska's sole representative in the House, and his powerful guest, Thomas Hale-Boggs Sr., the House Majority Leader from Louisiana. They are en route to a campaign fundraiser, a standard political engagement. The flight is expected to take around 3.5 hours, a short hop in the grand scale of Alaskan travel. The communication is routine at first. The plane is in contact with air traffic control, its progress tracked as it heads southeast. But then, somewhere over the vast Chugach National Forest, the radio falls silent. The blip on the radar screen vanishes. The Cessna 310, carrying one of the most influential men in the United States government, simply disappears without a trace, without a mayday call, without any indication of distress. Initial confusion quickly turns to alarm. When the plane fails to arrive in Juneau, a standard alert is issued. But as hours turn into a day, the scale of the crisis becomes terrifyingly clear. The vastness of the search area is staggering, a region larger than the state of California, characterized by extreme weather and nearly inaccessible terrain. The plane could be anywhere, submerged in a frigid lake, shattered against a remote mountain peak, or lost in the churning waters of the Gulf of Alaska. The disappearance triggers an immediate and massive response. It is not just a missing plane, it is a national emergency. A man who stood third in the line of presidential succession was on board. The mystery of what happened to Flight N1812H begins not with a bang, but with a deafening silence that would echo through the halls of power for decades to come. A silence that many would later claim was deliberately orchestrated. To understand the weight of this disappearance, we must first understand the men on board, particularly Hale-Boggs. He was no ordinary politician. Born in 1914, Boggs was a titan of the Democratic Party, a charismatic and sharp-witted Southerner who had served in Congress since 1941. By 1972, as House Majority Leader, his influence was immense, his voice shaping legislation and national policy. He was a political survivor, known for his ability to build consensus and wield power with a deft touch. His presence on that small plane elevated a regional incident into a national crisis. Alongside him was Nick Begich, a rising star in Alaskan politics. At 40, he had just been elected to his first term in the House of Representatives. Representing the vast and rugged state of Alaska, Begich was deeply invested in its development and future. The flight to Juneau was part of his effort to serve his constituents, bringing a powerful ally like Boggs to see the state's needs firsthand. His aide, Russell Brown, was a dedicated staffer, essential to the congressman's operations. All 3 were flying for a cause they believed in, connecting with the people they served. The man at the controls, Don Jones, was a seasoned pilot, but his history was not without blemishes. While experienced in the challenging conditions of Alaskan flying, later investigations would reveal a past that included legal troubles and a flying record that was less than perfect. He was a known political ally of Begich, a pilot who often flew local politicians across the state. In the initial hours, he was simply the pilot of a missing plane. But as the mystery deepened, his background would come under intense scrutiny, with some questioning his judgment and even his motives on that fateful day. The dynamic on the plane was a microcosm of American politics, established power, new ambition, and the operational support that makes it all possible. Boggs was the key figure, a man who had navigated the turbulent waters of Washington, D.C. for over 3 decades. He had seen presidents come and go, had weathered scandals, and had played a role in some of the most significant events in modern American history. His career was a testament to his political acumen, but it had also earned him powerful enemies. This was not just a tragic accident involving 4 individuals, it was the sudden, inexplicable removal of a major piece from the chessboard of American power. Boggs's disappearance left a vacuum, and as investigators began to search for the plane, others began to search for reasons. They would soon find that the majority leader had recently made himself a very dangerous man, challenging an institution that did not tolerate dissent. The search for the Cessna 310 was one of the largest and most intensive in American history. As soon as the plane was officially declared missing, a massive operation swung into action, coordinated by the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Air Force. The full might of the military was brought to bear on the Alaskan wilderness. For 39 agonizing days, the sky over southern Alaska was filled with the drone of search aircraft. Dozens of planes, including sophisticated SR-71 Blackbird spy planes and Coast Guard C-130s, scoured a search grid spanning over 325,000 square miles. The conditions were brutal and relentless. The search area covered the treacherous Chugach Mountains, Prince William Sound, and the Gulf of Alaska. Pilots and ground crews battled severe weather, with low cloud ceilings, freezing rain, and hurricane-force winds making a difficult task nearly impossible. The terrain itself was an adversary. The landscape was a jagged maze of snow-covered peaks, dense forests, and deep dark waters that could swallow a small plane without a trace. It was a search for a needle in a haystack the size of a country. Despite the unprecedented effort, the result was a chilling, absolute nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage was ever found. No oil slick on the water, no broken trees on a mountainside, no personal effects washed ashore. Most disturbingly, no signal was ever picked up from the aircraft's emergency locator transmitter, or ELT. This device was designed to automatically activate on impact and broadcast a distress signal, guiding rescuers to a crash site. The silence from the ELT was one of the most baffling aspects of the case. The official search was finally called off on November 24, 1972. The military concluded that the men were presumed lost and that further efforts would be futile. The families were devastated, left without closure, without a body to bury, without even a piece of wreckage to confirm their loved one's fate. The official record would state that the plane had simply vanished, a victim of the unforgiving Alaskan environment. The public was told it was a tragic accident, a story of man versus nature where nature had won. But for many, especially those in Washington, this explanation felt too simple, too clean. How could a plane carrying one of the country's most powerful men disappear so completely? The lack of any evidence at all was not just unusual, it was suspicious. It felt less like an accident and more like a perfectly executed disappearing act, sparking quiet whispers that the true cause was not to be found in the Alaskan wilderness, but in the corridors of power Boggs had just challenged. In the absence of wreckage, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, were left to piece together a plausible scenario. Their final report, published months later, painted a picture of a flight doomed by a confluence of factors. The primary theory centered on the severe weather conditions. The investigation concluded that the Cessna 310 likely encountered severe icing, which can dramatically affect an aircraft's aerodynamics and performance, leading to a loss of control and a rapid, unrecoverable descent. The report also pointed to the pilot, Don Jones. While he was experienced, the investigation noted that the flight was conducted under Visual Flight Rules, VFR, which was questionable given the poor weather forecast. An Instrument Flight Rules, IFR, plan would have provided more rigorous air traffic control tracking. This decision, combined with the challenging conditions, suggested the possibility of pilot error. The official narrative was straightforward. An experienced but perhaps overly confident pilot made a judgment call that, when combined with Alaska's treacherous weather, proved fatal. This explanation accounted for the crash itself, but it failed to address the most glaring question: the complete absence of evidence. Why had the ELT failed to activate? The NTSB report suggested several possibilities. The device could have been destroyed on impact, its antenna could have broken off, or it might have been submerged in water, which would block its signal. While plausible, for a modern ELT to fail so completely was statistically unlikely. This single point of failure in the official story became a foothold for doubt. Furthermore, the idea that a plane crash, even a violent one, would leave absolutely no trace strained credulity. In most cases, even crashes in remote areas or at sea eventually yield some debris. An oil slick, a floating seat cushion, a piece of the fuselage. Something almost always surfaces. The search for the Cessna, however, was uniquely sterile. It was as if the aircraft and its 4 occupants had been plucked from existence, leaving behind only an official report that felt more like a best guess estimate than a definitive conclusion. The finality of the government's report stood in stark contrast to the lingering uncertainty. It closed the book on the investigation but opened the door to a host of troubling questions. For those who knew Hale Boggs and the enemies he had made, the official story of a simple, tragic accident was a convenient fiction. It ignored the dangerous political currents swirling around Boggs just before he stepped onto that plane. Currents that pointed toward a far more sinister explanation for his disappearance. Voice over part break. To understand the darker theories surrounding the disappearance of Hale Boggs, one must look at the political climate of 1972 and the powerful figures Boggs had openly challenged. At the top of that list was J. Edgar Hoover, the formidable and feared director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For nearly 50 years, Hoover had built the FBI into his personal fiefdom, an agency that operated with immense autonomy and was known for its aggressive surveillance tactics against perceived enemies of the state, a list that often included politicians who crossed him. In April 1971, just over a year before his disappearance, Hale Boggs took to the floor of the House of Representatives and did the unthinkable. He publicly attacked J. Edgar Hoover. He accused the FBI of tapping the phones of congressmen and senators, calling it a hallmark of a secret police. He demanded Hoover's immediate resignation, stating that the director's long tenure had made him too powerful and unaccountable. This was a direct public challenge to one of the most vindictive men in American history. Hoover was notorious for collecting secret files on political figures, using the information for blackmail and intimidation. An attack like the one from Boggs was not something he would forgive or forget. While Hoover died in May 1972, 5 months before Boggs's plane vanished, his institution remained. The FBI, molded in his image, was a culture of loyalty and retribution. The systems of surveillance and the animosity towards Boggs did not die with its director. The question lingered. Had Boggs made an enemy of the entire FBI? This context transforms the narrative. The disappearance is no longer just a potential accident. It becomes a potential political assassination. In the tense atmosphere of the early 1970s, with the Vietnam War raging and the Watergate scandal beginning to unfold, paranoia was rampant in Washington. The idea that a powerful government agency could be involved in the disappearance of a high-ranking critic was not just a wild conspiracy theory. To some, it felt like a plausible extension of the era's political realities. The FBI's official involvement in the investigation into Boggs's disappearance only added another layer of suspicion. The very agency he had accused of corruption was now tasked with helping to find him. Records would later show the FBI opened a file on the disappearance, but its contents and the extent of their assistance remain subjects of debate. For critics, it was a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse, allowing the Bureau to control the narrative and ensure that inconvenient questions were never answered. The conflict with J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was explosive. But it was not the only controversial chapter in Hale Boggs's long career. To find another potential motive for his disappearance, one must go back nearly a decade to another national trauma: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Boggs to serve on the Warren Commission, the official body tasked with investigating the assassination. It was a role that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Publicly, Boggs endorsed the commission's final report, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. This was the official story presented to the American people. However, behind the scenes, Boggs was a vocal dissenter. He harbored deep reservations about the commission's findings, particularly the controversial single bullet theory, which was central to the lone gunman conclusion. He reportedly argued fiercely with other commission members, including future President Gerald Ford and former CIA Director Allen Dulles. According to journalists and historians who later interviewed his contemporaries, Boggs felt that the commission had not pursued all leads and had rushed to a conclusion to reassure a frightened public. He privately expressed the belief that there was more to the story, that powerful forces might have been involved. One famous anecdote claims that in a heated argument with Allen Dulles, Boggs pointed his finger and said, "Allen, the whole thing smells of the CIA." He believed the investigation had been compromised from within. Years later, Boggs's doubts did not fade. They grew. He reportedly told friends and family that he regretted not filing a formal minority report expressing his dissent. He felt he had been part of a cover-up. In the early 1970s, as new evidence emerged and public skepticism about the Warren report grew, some researchers believe Boggs was considering going public with his inside knowledge of the commission's flawed investigation. If true, this would have made him a threat to anyone invested in protecting the official narrative of the Kennedy assassination. This connection adds a profound and chilling layer to his disappearance. If Boggs was on the verge of revealing secrets about the most seismic political event of the 20th century, his sudden vanishing becomes much more than a coincidence. It places him at the intersection of two of America's greatest mysteries. Was his flight to Juneau simply a campaign trip, or was it an escape that failed? The possibility remains that what Hale Boggs knew, or what others thought he knew, made him too dangerous to be allowed to speak freely. The search and rescue operation was a massive public spectacle, a dramatic display of military might against the forces of nature. For 39 days, the world watched as hundreds of aircraft scoured the Alaskan wilderness. The official narrative was one of a heroic, albeit failed, effort. But behind the curtain of this public-facing operation, a different kind of search was taking place, one conducted not with planes but with paper, files, and informants. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly and meticulously building its own case. Declassified FBI documents, obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, reveal the depth of the Bureau's interest in the case. The files show that the FBI's involvement began almost immediately, and it went far beyond simply assisting the search. Agents were dispatched to interview family members, political associates, and anyone connected to the 4 missing men. They weren't just looking for clues about a plane crash. They were conducting a full-fledged background investigation, digging into the lives and potential motives of everyone involved. The Bureau's primary focus was, unsurprisingly, the pilot, Don Johns. Agents meticulously chronicled his personal and professional life. They uncovered his past financial difficulties, his legal troubles, and his reputation as a risk-taker. The files paint a portrait of a man who was perhaps not as stable or reliable as a congressman's pilot should be. This intense focus on Johns served a dual purpose. It was a legitimate line of inquiry, but it also conveniently shifted the narrative away from political motivations and squarely onto the possibility of pilot error or even sabotage orchestrated by a rogue individual. However, the files also reveal something more telling. Despite Hale Boggs's public accusations against the Bureau, the internal memos regarding his disappearance are clinical and detached. There is little acknowledgement of the profound animosity between Boggs and the FBI. This professional silence is itself suspicious. It suggests a carefully managed internal response, an effort to control information and frame the investigation in a way that protected the Bureau's interests. The very institution Boggs accused of operating a secret police force was now in a position to shape the official memory of his demise. These documents provide concrete historical evidence of a parallel investigation, one driven by the FBI's own agenda. While the Coast Guard searched for wreckage, the FBI was searching for a story, a plausible explanation that would satisfy the public and crucially deflect any suspicion away from Washington, D.C. The files don't contain a smoking gun, but they reveal a clear pattern of information control, making the official narrative of a simple accident seem like a carefully constructed conclusion rather than an evidence-based one. The official explanation, a tragic accident caused by bad weather and pilot error, provided a neat, if unsatisfying, conclusion. It attributed the disappearance to the impersonal forces of nature and human fallibility. This narrative effectively closed the case, allowing the political world to move on. But for those who found this explanation too convenient, the complete lack of physical evidence became a fertile ground for alternative theories. These theories moved beyond simple accident or pilot error and ventured into the murky territory of deliberate, covert action. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the Cessna was sabotaged. The idea posits that a bomb was placed on the aircraft, small enough to cripple it in midair, but not necessarily powerful enough to create a massive, easily identifiable debris field. A mid-air explosion over the vast and remote Alaskan landscape could scatter wreckage over such a wide area that finding any single piece would be virtually impossible. This would also explain the failure of the ELT, as the device would have been destroyed in the initial blast, never getting the chance to transmit a signal upon impact with the ground. Proponents of this theory point to the political enemies Boggs had made. A bomb on the plane would be a targeted assassination, a clean and effective way to silence a powerful critic. It would require access to the aircraft, which was stored at the Anchorage International Airport. Investigators did look into airport security and the plane's maintenance records, but found no direct evidence of tampering. However, in 1972, airport security was far more lax than it is today, and gaining access to a small private plane would not have been an insurmountable challenge for a determined and well-resourced organization. Another theory centers on the pilot, Don Johns, suggesting he was not a victim but a perpetrator. This line of speculation paints Johns as a compromised individual, coerced or paid to deliberately crash the plane. His checkered past and financial troubles made him a potential target for blackmail or bribery. In this scenario, he could have flown the plane to a predetermined remote location, crashing it in a way that would guarantee its complete destruction and concealment, perhaps in a deep glacial crevasse or a remote uncharted lake. This theory, while more dramatic, is harder to substantiate without any knowledge of Johns' state of mind or any evidence of a conspiracy. These alternative scenarios, from a hidden bomb to a complicit pilot, all stem from the same fundamental problem with the official story: the absolute void of evidence. Nature, while powerful, is rarely so tidy. The disappearance was too clean, too perfect. For many, the idea that human intervention was involved provided a more logical, if more terrifying, explanation for how a modern aircraft carrying 4 men could simply cease to exist in the middle of a routine flight. While speculation about bombs and conspiracies captured the imagination, a more grounded and perhaps more plausible alternative theory involves a different kind of human element: a second, unknown aircraft. This theory suggests that the Cessna 310 did not crash due to weather or mechanical failure, but was intentionally brought down by another party in the air. A mid-air collision or even an attack could explain the suddenness of the disappearance and the lack of a distress call. The pilots would have had no time to react or radio for help. This scenario has several compelling aspects. Firstly, it could account for the complete destruction of the plane and the wide, undetectable scattering of debris. A high-speed aerial impact would obliterate a small plane like the Cessna. Secondly, it introduces a motive that is purely political. The act would be a targeted assassination carried out with military precision. Who would have the capability and the motive to carry out such an audacious act? The list is short, and it points directly back to the intelligence communities Boggs had criticized. Evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. In the weeks following the disappearance, some local Alaskan pilots and residents came forward with unusual stories. There were scattered reports of unidentified aircraft in the region around the time of the Cessna's last known position. These reports were largely dismissed by official investigators as unreliable or irrelevant. However, in the context of a potential conspiracy, they take on a different light. Was there another plane in the sky that day? One that was never meant to be on any official flight log. Furthermore, this theory could also explain the silence of the emergency locator transmitter. An attacking aircraft would not just down the plane. It would ensure all traces were eliminated. This could involve jamming the ELT frequency or ensuring the impact was so catastrophic that the device was instantly vaporized. It's a chilling thought, but for an organization looking to carry out a deniable operation, leaving no electronic trail would be a top priority. This theory transforms the vast, empty Alaskan sky from a neutral backdrop into a potential crime scene. It suggests that the danger to Hale Boggs and his companions came not from the storm clouds below, but from something far more deliberate and sinister flying alongside them. While there is no definitive proof, the second aircraft theory remains one of the most compelling explanations for those who believe the disappearance of Flight M1812H was no accident but a calculated act of political murder. The official cessation of the search on November 24, 1972 marked the end of any hope for a rescue, but it did not end the political story. In an unusual and poignant turn of events, both Hale Boggs and Nick Begich were on the ballot for the congressional elections held on November 7th. While the search was still active, under the laws of their respective states, their names could not be removed. In a testament to their popularity and the hope their constituents held out for their survival, both men were posthumously re-elected by wide margins. This created a unique political situation. 2 congressional seats were now held by men who were, for all official purposes, deceased. This necessitated special elections to fill the vacancies. The Democratic Party, seeking to honor the legacies of the lost congressmen, turned to the people who knew them best, their wives. In Louisiana, Lindy Boggs ran for her husband's seat, and in Alaska, Peggy Begich ran for hers. Both women were charismatic and politically astute, having been partners in their husbands' careers for years. Their campaigns were emotional and powerful. They were not just running for office, they were carrying a torch, promising to continue the work their husbands had started. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. In March 1973, Lindy Boggs won the special election in Louisiana, and Peggy Begich, though ultimately unsuccessful in her bid against Republican Don Young, cemented the Begich family's legacy in Alaskan politics. Lindy Boggs would go on to have a distinguished career in Congress, serving for nearly 18 years, and later becoming the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. The political aftermath demonstrated the deep impact the 2 men had on their communities. Their legacies were not erased by their disappearance. Instead, they were transformed. The tragic event launched the political careers of their widows and created a lasting dynasty. The Boggs and Begich names remained potent forces in state and national politics for decades, a constant reminder of the unresolved mystery that started it all. The personal tragedy for the families was immense, a lifetime of not knowing, but the political story continued. However, this continuation also served a purpose for those who wanted the mystery to fade away. By filling the political vacuum and creating a story of resilience and legacy, the focus shifted from the how and why of the disappearance to the inspiring narrative of the families carrying on. The urgent questions about a potential conspiracy were gradually replaced by the more comfortable story of political succession, allowing the unsettling core of the mystery to recede from the public consciousness. While the political legacies of Boggs and Begich evolved, the mystery of their disappearance remained frozen in time, a source of unending pain for their families. For years, they were trapped in a legal and emotional limbo. Without a body or wreckage, a person cannot be officially declared dead for a period of several years, depending on state law. The families had to navigate a complex legal process to have their loved ones declared legally deceased. a painful procedure that forced them to formally abandon any hope of their return. The psychological toll was immense. Cokie Roberts, the late journalist and daughter of Hale and Lindy Boggs, spoke often about the profound impact her father's disappearance had on her family. She described the agony of not knowing, the endless cycle of hope and despair that followed the initial event. Every report of a found hiker or a newly discovered piece of old wreckage in Alaska would spark a brief, painful glimmer of hope that this might be the answer, only to be extinguished again. It was a wound that could never fully heal because there was no closure. The families of Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Jones faced the same agonizing uncertainty. They were left to grapple with theories ranging from a simple accident to a complex government conspiracy. Pege Begich, in particular, became a vocal advocate for a more thorough investigation, never fully accepting the official explanation. She and others spent years pushing for new searches and the release of government documents, convinced that the full story had not been told. Their private grief was intertwined with a public quest for answers that never came. This human cost is often lost in the discussion of political intrigue and conspiracy theories. These were not just powerful men or political figures, they were husbands, fathers, and sons. Their disappearance left a void in the lives of their families that could never be filled. The official report might have closed the case file, but for the people who loved them, the case was and remains perpetually open. The lack of a final resting place, of a definitive explanation, meant that the mourning process was never truly complete. The true impact of that day in 1972 was not. The initial investigation into Judge Joseph Force Crater's disappearance was a purely local affair, handled by the New York City Police Department. For weeks, the case was a chaotic whirlwind of city politics, tabloid sensationalism, and dead-end leads confined to the 5 boroughs. However, as the trail grew colder and the political implications became starker, whispers began to circulate about federal involvement. The Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, under the ambitious and meticulous J. Edgar Hoover, was building its reputation as the nation's premier law enforcement agency. A high-profile case like this, involving a prominent judge, should have been squarely in its wheelhouse. Yet, the Bureau's entry into the Crater case was conspicuously late and notably reluctant. Official records show a hesitant approach, a stark contrast to the aggressive tactics Hoover was becoming known for. This wasn't an oversight. Hoover was a master strategist, keenly aware of public perception and political maneuvering. The Crater case was a toxic cocktail of judicial corruption, political scandal, and potential organized crime connections, all tied to the powerful Tammany Hall machine. For Hoover, inserting his bureau into such a messy, unwinnable local feud was a significant risk with little reward. A failed investigation could tarnish his agency's burgeoning image of invincibility. The pressure to federalize the case came not from a desire for justice, but from the political fallout. As the NYPD's investigation stalled, accusations of a cover-up grew louder. Some believed that involving the federal government would bring a level of impartiality that the locally controlled police force could not. Others, however, saw it as a way for city officials to offload a public relations nightmare. The FBI's jurisdiction was also a complex legal question at the time, as kidnapping was not yet a federal crime unless the victim was transported across state lines, an element for which there was absolutely no evidence. This jurisdictional ambiguity provided Hoover with the perfect excuse to keep his distance initially. He allowed the NYPD to exhaust their resources and face the public's wrath. Only when it became politically untenable to remain on the sidelines did the Bureau of Investigation formally open a file, but their involvement was never a full-scale takeover. It was more of a shadow investigation, a monitoring of the local effort, collecting intelligence and quietly assessing the key players without committing the full force of the federal government. This careful, calculated distance suggests the Bureau knew this was no ordinary missing person case. The FBI's reticence was a clear signal to those paying attention. Judge Crater had vanished into a vortex so powerful and so corrupt that even the nation's top lawman was wary of being pulled in. This was not just about a missing man, it was about a system protecting itself. To truly grasp the reasons for this federal hesitation, one must look beyond the crime itself and into the heart of the political beast that ran New York City, a shadowy organization whose influence reached into every corner of the justice system Crater was sworn to uphold. To understand the disappearance of Judge Crater, one cannot simply look at the man. One must examine the world he inhabited. New York City in 1930 was not just a metropolis. It was a kingdom ruled by Tammany Hall. This Democratic Party political machine was the de facto government, a deeply entrenched network of patronage, power, and corruption that controlled everything from judicial appointments to construction contracts. It was a system built on loyalty and silence, where favors were currency and crossing the wrong person could mean the end of a career, or worse. Judge Crater was not an outsider to this system. He was a product of it, a willing and ambitious participant. His appointment to the New York Supreme Court was a reward for his service to the machine. He was known as a Tammany man, and his role often involved navigating the murky waters where law and political favor blurred. He was the president of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Independent Club, a Tammany-affiliated political club which placed him at the nexus of significant power plays. This position gave him intimate knowledge of the financial dealings, the secret agreements, and the dirty laundry of some of the most powerful men in the state. He knew who was being paid, who was being promoted, and why. This knowledge was a source of his power, but it was also a profound liability. In the summer of 1930, the foundations of Tammany Hall were beginning to crack. A state-level investigation, the Seabury Commission, was gearing up to expose the rot within the city's government. The commission was aggressively investigating the sale of political offices and judicial seats, a practice in which Crater was rumored to be deeply involved. It was whispered that judgeships were being sold for sums exceeding $100,000, and Crater, as a trusted insider, would have been a key witness. His disappearance occurred just as this scrutiny was intensifying. This context transforms the mystery from a simple missing person case into a potential political assassination. Was Crater planning to testify? Had he been threatened to ensure his silence? Or was he a liability who knew too much and was preemptively removed from the board before he could be subpoenaed by investigators? His connection to Tammany Hall meant that the list of potential suspects was not just a handful of criminals, but an entire political establishment with a vested interest in keeping its secrets buried. The very people tasked with finding him were, in many cases, loyal to the same machine that may have wanted him gone. The NYPD's seemingly inept investigation suddenly appears in a different light. It may not have been incompetence, but a deliberate obfuscation, a slow walking of the case orchestrated by powers far above the street-level detective. The police were navigating a minefield, aware that turning over the wrong rock could bring the entire corrupt edifice crashing down on their own heads. The search for Crater wasn't just a search for a body, it was a search for the truth in a city built on lies, where the most dangerous secrets were hidden not in dark alleys, but in the polished halls of power. When investigators were finally able to access Judge Crater's locked apartment and courthouse chambers, they were not met with signs of a struggle, but with a series of meticulously arranged clues that seemed designed to both inform and confuse. In his chambers, they found his judicial robes neatly hung and his briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a trove of documents, including several large checks he had cashed in the days leading up to his disappearance, totaling over $5,000, a significant sum in 1930. Equivalent to nearly $90,000 today. He had withdrawn this cash but left it, along with his wallet and keys, in the briefcase. This was not the behavior of a man planning a simple, secret getaway. The most perplexing discovery, however, was in the fireplace of his Fifth Avenue apartment. Stella Crater, his wife, found bundles of burned papers. The destruction was thorough, leaving behind little more than fine ash. What secrets were contained in those documents? Were they financial records detailing the sale of judgeships? A list of bribes, personal correspondence that could have provided a motive. This act of deliberate destruction points to a man methodically erasing his own trail, or a part of it, with a clear purpose. It suggests he was aware of a looming threat and was taking calculated steps to protect himself or others. Among the documents that survived, investigators pieced together a portrait of a man under immense financial and professional pressure. There were records of stock market losses from the 1929 crash, loans, and complex real estate transactions. He was a man living beyond his means, juggling debts and obligations that his judicial salary alone could not cover. This financial strain could provide a motive for any number of desperate acts. It made him vulnerable to blackmail, and it could have driven him to participate in the illicit sale of offices that the Seabury Commission was investigating. The money he withdrew could have been for a payoff, an escape fund, or hush money. These physical pieces of evidence, the cashed checks, the abandoned briefcase, the burned documents, became the core of the investigation. They were tangible facts in a case rapidly dissolving into rumor and speculation. Detectives and later FBI agents would spend countless hours trying to trace the source of that money and theorize about the contents of the incinerated files. The paper trail offered a glimpse into Crater's final days, revealing a man systematically putting his affairs in order for some kind of climactic event. But the narrative it told was incomplete, a story with the most crucial pages violently ripped out and turned to ash. The state of his office and apartment created a chilling paradox. The scene was simultaneously one of careful preparation and abrupt departure. He packed his briefcase for a trip he never took, withdrew money he never spent, and burned files just before vanishing. It was as if he was preparing for multiple eventualities, hedging his bets against an uncertain future. This meticulous yet contradictory evidence trail only deepened the enigma, suggesting that whatever happened to Judge Crater on the night of August 6th was the final move in a complex game he had been playing for a very long time. Beyond the world of political corruption and financial dealings, Judge Crater's personal life was equally complex, centered around two key women: his wife, Stella Mansweiler, and his mistress, a showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz. Each woman held a different piece of the puzzle, and their testimonies would become critical yet conflicting pillars of the investigation. Their perspectives painted a picture of a man leading a carefully compartmentalized double life, a division that may have been a source of the pressure that led to his disappearance. The exploration of these relationships provides a fascinating look at the more personal side of this mystery, a narrative thread often found in the most compelling examples of soft true crime. Stella Crater was the loyal, long-suffering wife. She was vacationing in Maine when her husband vanished and did not report him missing for 10 days, a delay that has been the subject of much speculation. She claimed he had sent her a letter, which has since been lost, telling her he might be delayed on business and that she trusted him implicitly. When the investigation finally began, she was steadfast in her belief that her husband had met with foul play, a victim of the corrupt system he served. She spent the rest of her life searching for answers, eventually having him declared legally dead in 1939 to access his estate. Her public persona was one of a devoted widow, but investigators privately wondered how much she truly knew about her husband's other life. That other life was personified by Sally Lou Ritz, a vivacious chorus girl from the Follies. Crater had set her up in an apartment and was known to be deeply infatuated with her. She represented the glamour and excitement of Broadway, a stark contrast to the staid respectability of his judicial career. When questioned by police, Sally Lou's story was inconsistent. Initially, she claimed to know nothing, but later admitted that the judge had been in a state of high anxiety in the weeks before he vanished. She spoke of cryptic phone calls and a sense of impending doom, telling friends that Crater felt he was in danger. Sally Lou's testimony was a bombshell, suggesting Crater was not a man who simply walked away, but one who was running from something or someone. However, her credibility was questioned. As a showgirl and a kept woman, she was viewed with suspicion by the authorities and the press of the era. Was she telling the truth, or was she an opportunist embellishing her story for attention? After a brief period in the media spotlight, Sally Lou Ritz disappeared from the public eye, her crucial testimony fading into the background of the larger political scandal. The police were left with two irreconcilable portraits of Crater: the dutiful husband described by his wife, and the terrified man described by his mistress. The stark difference between these two narratives highlights the central enigma of Joseph Crater. Was he the victim Stella believed him to be, or the frightened fugitive Sally Lou described? Or was he somehow both? His ability to maintain these two separate lives, one of public service and one of private indulgence, speaks to a complex and secretive personality. It's possible that the secret to his disappearance lay not in the grand corruption of Tammany Hall, but in the volatile intersection of these two worlds, where a personal indiscretion could have provided the leverage for a political enemy. As the investigation dragged on, a palpable and unseen pressure began to bear down on everyone involved. Witnesses who had initially been eager to talk suddenly developed faulty memories. Police leads that seemed promising would mysteriously dry up. Key figures in Tammany Hall, who undoubtedly knew Crater and his business, presented a unified front of ignorance. This was not the typical challenge of a difficult case. It was a coordinated, systemic wall of silence. The powerful machinery of the city was actively working against the discovery of the truth, creating an environment where fear and self-preservation trumped any sense of civic duty or justice. Detectives on the case reported being stonewalled at every turn. When they tried to question high-level political figures, they were met with legal roadblocks and bureaucratic delays. Evidence logs from the period are thin, with many interviews summarized in frustratingly vague terms. It became clear that anyone who might have had valuable information was too afraid to come forward, fearing the same fate that befell the judge. This orchestrated silence was the most compelling evidence that Crater's disappearance was not a random act of violence or a personal decision to flee, but a calculated execution of a cover-up at the highest levels of city government. These are the kinds of stories we are committed to telling, the ones buried under layers of influence and time. These are historical curiosities that challenge our understanding of the past, offering glimpses into complex cases where the official narrative is far from the whole story. If you find these deep dives into real unsolved mysteries and phenomena inexplicables compelling, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We believe that some stories are too important to remain forgotten, and your support helps us continue to uncover them. Our goal is to provide fast, direct, and intriguing stories, focusing on true crime soft that provokes thought and generates immediate curiosity. The pressure on the crater investigation was a silent, crushing force, one that warped the very fabric of the search for truth, and it's a pattern seen in many other unsolved cases throughout history. The few individuals who did speak out often faced immediate consequences. A taxi driver who claimed to have driven Crater on the night he disappeared gave a detailed account, only to later recant his entire story under suspicious circumstances. This pattern of witness intimidation demonstrated the reach and ruthlessness of the forces at play. They weren't just hiding a crime, they were actively sanitizing the historical record in real time, ensuring that no credible evidence would survive. This invisible hand guiding the investigation, or rather misguiding it, is why the case remains so maddeningly unsolved. The pressure extended even to the press. While the tabloids ran wild with sensational theories, more serious journalistic inquiries were subtly discouraged. The story was framed as a simple mystery, a man who walked away from his life, rather than an expose of the deep-seated corruption it truly represented. The wall of silence was not just for witnesses, it was for the entire city. The message was clear. Judge Crater is gone, and for your own good, you will forget him. This manufactured amnesia was largely successful, turning a political bombshell into a piece of quaint, unresolved folklore. For decades, the case of Judge Joseph Force Crater lay dormant, a cold file gathering dust in the archives of the NYPD and the FBI. It had become a piece of New York City legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of power and corruption. But with no new leads, it was considered permanently unsolved. The main players had all passed away. His wife Stella, his mistress Sally Lou, and the powerful Tammany bosses. The trail was not just cold, it was frozen in time. Then, in August 2005, 75 years after the judge vanished, the silence was broken by a voice from the grave. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A woman named Stella Ferrucci Good, who had passed away in Queens, New York, left behind a sealed envelope with her belongings. Inside was a handwritten letter, a deathbed confession she had written years earlier, but had instructed her family not to open until after her death. The letter contained a shocking and detailed account of what she claimed was the true fate of Judge Crater. It was not a theory or speculation. It was a first-hand account of a murder, naming the men responsible and the location of the body. According to the letter, Ferrucci Good's husband, a New York City police officer named Robert Good, had confessed the story to her on his own deathbed years prior. The letter alleged that Judge Crater was murdered by a group of men, including a high-ranking police officer and Charles Burns, a taxi driver and enforcer with connections to the mob. The motive, as stated in the note, was tied directly to the corruption that Crater was a part of. He had been killed to ensure his silence, a direct hit ordered by powerful figures who feared his potential testimony to the Seabury Commission. The most stunning detail in the letter was the location of the body. Ferrucci Good wrote that after the murder, Crater's body was taken to Coney Island in Brooklyn. There, under the boardwalk near West 8th Street, the killers buried him in the sand. The letter specified that the site where he was buried would later become the home of the New York Aquarium. This was an incredibly specific, verifiable detail that had never been part of any previous theory in the case. It was a concrete lead in a case that had been devoid of them for 3/4 of a century. This posthumous confession sent a shockwave through the law enforcement community and reignited public interest in the nation's missing man. It was a bombshell revelation, a potential solution to one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. For the first time, there was a coherent narrative that connected all the disparate elements of the case: the political corruption, the mob involvement, and the complicity of law enforcement. The letter was a roadmap to the truth, but it also raised a new set of questions. Was this confession credible? And after so many years, could any of it possibly be proven? The discovery of Stella Ferrucci Good's letter was a watershed moment. But for investigators, it was also the beginning of a new and complex challenge. A deathbed confession, especially one relayed secondhand, is not the same as hard evidence. The first step for the New York City Police Department was to deconstruct the note, to vet its contents and assess its credibility. They had to determine if this was the genuine key to the entire mystery, or simply an elaborate piece of folklore, a family story that had grown into a legend over the decades. The task was to separate historical fact from potential fiction. Investigators began by examining the individuals named in the letter. Charles Burns, the taxi driver and alleged mob enforcer, was a real person with a known criminal record and connections that placed him in the right circles. The police officer mentioned, while his name has often been withheld in official reports, was also a real figure, a man who would have had the authority and the means to participate in such a crime and its subsequent cover-up. The fact that the letter named actual verifiable people from that era lent it a significant degree of initial credibility. These weren't phantom figures from a novel. They were men who walked the streets of 1930s New York. The motive described in the letter also aligned perfectly with the most plausible theories of the case. The idea that Crater was silenced to prevent his testimony before the Seabury Commission was a theory that had persisted since 1930. The confession provided a specific mechanism for that theory, implicating not just the political bosses who gave the order, but the street-level enforcers and corrupt cops who carried it out. It explained the efficiency of the disappearance and the subsequent wall of silence that surrounded the investigation. It was a clean, logical solution to a very messy problem. However, there were also reasons for skepticism. The story was passed down through 2 deathbed confessions, from the alleged killer to his wife, and then from the wife to posterity. Memories can be altered, details can be exaggerated, and the original confession from Robert Good could have been a boast or a fabrication. Furthermore, Stella Ferrucci Good wrote the letter years before her death. Why wait so long? Was it a genuine fear of reprisal or something else? Investigators had to consider the possibility that the story was an amalgamation of rumors and newspaper clippings, filtered through the memory of an elderly woman. Ultimately, the letter's credibility rested on its most sensational claim: the location of the body. If Judge Crater's remains could be found under the New York Aquarium at Coney Island, the confession would be validated beyond any doubt. It was a testable hypothesis. The note provided a clear, physical target for a modern investigation. Without that physical proof, the letter would remain a tantalizing but unproven piece of the puzzle, another chapter in the long and frustrating history of intriguing theories surrounding the case. The focus of the investigation now shifted from the past to the present, from dusty archives to the sandy ground of Coney Island. The claim in Stella Ferrucci Good's letter was astonishingly precise. Judge Crater was buried under the ground where the New York Aquarium now stands in Coney Island. This detail transformed the case from a historical abstraction into a modern-day treasure hunt, albeit a grim one. The prospect of excavating a major public landmark to search for the 75-year-old remains of a missing judge presented a host of logistical, financial, and political challenges. The NYPD had to seriously consider whether the lead was strong enough to justify such a monumental undertaking. Geographically, the theory was plausible. In 1930, the area specified was far less developed. The iconic boardwalk was there, but much of the surrounding land was sandy and relatively remote, especially at night. It would have been a feasible location to dispose of a body without attracting too much attention. Over the subsequent decades, as Coney Island was redeveloped and the aquarium was constructed in the late 1950s, tons of concrete and steel were poured over the very spot. Any evidence of a clandestine burial would have been sealed beneath layers of modern infrastructure. Police and historians began to research the construction history of the aquarium. They looked at old maps, blueprints, and photographs to determine if there were any undocumented excavations or strange discoveries made during the building process. The hope was that some old construction report might mention the discovery of human remains, an anomaly that was dismissed or covered up at the time. However, the search of these archives yielded nothing. The construction of the aquarium had proceeded without any recorded incidents that would corroborate the letter's claim. The question of a modern excavation was debated intensely. Using ground-penetrating radar was proposed as a non-invasive first step to see if any anomalies could be detected beneath the aquarium's foundations. However, the technology has its limits, especially in detecting skeletal remains that have been in the ground for so long and are buried so deep beneath layers of concrete and fill. A full-scale dig would be incredibly disruptive and expensive, requiring parts of the aquarium to be shut down and dismantled. Without more corroborating evidence, city officials were reluctant to authorize such a drastic and costly operation based on a single, unverified letter. In the end, no excavation was ever performed. The Coney Island theory remains just that, a theory. The lack of a physical search means the confession can neither be proven nor disproven. The image of Judge Crater's remains lying entombed beneath a popular tourist attraction is a powerful and haunting one, a perfect cinematic ending to his story. But without the will to dig, the ghosts of the boardwalk will keep their secrets. The letter provided a tantalizing glimpse of a possible truth, but the final, definitive proof remains buried, perhaps forever, under the shifting sands and concrete of Coney Island. The confession letter. By 1968, the official file on the disappearance of Dr. Aris Thorne was gathering dust. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, after a brief but intense period of activity, issued a terse and unsatisfying statement. The case was declared inactive, relegated to the cold archives of unsolved mysteries. To the public and the press, the message was clear. All leads had been exhausted. Thorne, a brilliant but reclusive physicist, had simply vanished, a victim of either a personal crisis or an unfortunate undiscovered accident. The official narrative was neat, tidy, and deliberately devoid of the strange details that had initially plagued the investigation, such as the bizarre, untraceable alloy found in his workshop or the cryptic, half-finished equations on his blackboard. The local sheriff's office in rural Oregon, which had been unceremoniously sidelined by the federal agents, was instructed to file their own reports as closed pending new evidence. This bureaucratic maneuver effectively sealed the case from local scrutiny. The townsfolk, who had whispered theories about everything from Soviet spies to otherworldly encounters, eventually moved on. The story of the missing scientist became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to children, its sharp edges of fact worn smooth over time by rumor and speculation. The government's silence was a powerful tool, transforming a disturbing national security event into a quaint regional ghost story. Internally, however, the file was stamped with a classification level far exceeding that of a standard missing persons case. Memos circulated between J. Edgar Hoover's office and select department heads, referencing the Thorne case only by a code name, Project Chimera. These documents, many of which would not see the light of day for another 4 decades, paint a picture not of a failed investigation, but of a successful containment. The goal, it seemed, was not to find Dr. Thorne, but to ensure that whatever he was working on and whatever had happened to him remained buried forever under layers of official denial and public indifference. This strategy of strategic forgetting was a hallmark of the era. In the high-stakes chess game of the Cold War, a missing piece like Dr. Thorne was a liability. It was far safer to remove the piece from the board entirely than to risk the opponent discovering its power. The FBI's handling of the case was a masterclass in information control, demonstrating how an official narrative could be crafted to obscure a truth far more complex and potentially more terrifying than the public could. Imagine, the agency wasn't just investigating a disappearance, it was managing a secret. But secrets, especially those held within large bureaucratic institutions, have a way of seeping out. While the official file was closed, the unofficial one remained wide open in the minds of a few key agents who had been on the ground. They had seen the evidence firsthand before it was catalogued, classified, and spirited away to a secure facility in Langley. They knew the public story was a fabrication, a carefully constructed facade, and one of those agents, a young but sharp investigator named Robert Miller, couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just lost a man. They had stumbled upon something that was actively being hidden from them. Agent Robert Miller was a man of process and order. A product of the FBI's rigorous training, he believed in evidence, procedure, and the chain of command. Yet, the Thorne case defied all three. From the moment he and his partner arrived at the physicist's isolated cabin, the investigation felt wrong. Key pieces of evidence, like Thorne's personal logs and a series of strange star charts, were confiscated not by the forensics team, but by a separate, unidentified unit from Washington, D.C., who arrived in unmarked black sedans. They operated with an authority that superseded Miller's own, and their paperwork was vague and impenetrable. In the weeks that followed, Miller's reports were consistently returned to him with red ink. His observations on the unusual electromagnetic readings in the lab and the non-terrestrial composition of the metal fragment dismissed as speculative or irrelevant to the subject's disappearance. He was subtly but firmly steered away from any line of inquiry that touched upon the nature of Thorne's classified work. The official directive was to focus on plausible, mundane explanations. A secret lover, gambling debts, or a defection. Yet none of the evidence supported these conventional theories. Thorne was a man with no vices, no significant personal relationships, and a deep, almost fanatical devotion to his country and his work. The breaking point for Miller came during an interview with Thorne's academic mentor, a professor at Caltech. The elderly man, initially cooperative, received a phone call mid-interview. Miller watched as the color drained from the professor's face. After hanging up, he refused to answer any more questions, stating only that he had been mistaken about the nature of his protege's research and could not comment further due to national security. Miller knew he had been warned off. The call, he later suspected, came from the same shadowy figures who had sanitized the crime scene. Haunted by the inconsistencies, Miller began keeping a private file, a collection of his original unedited notes and carbon copies of his redacted reports. It was a career-ending risk, a direct violation of Bureau protocol. He documented the names of the men from Washington, the serial numbers on their vehicles, and the specific pieces of evidence they seized. He believed that the truth of what happened to Eris Thorne was not in what the FBI found, but in what it so desperately and efficiently chose to hide. This clandestine dossier was a testament to his conviction that the Bureau was not just investigating a mystery, but actively participating in a cover-up. This internal conflict festered within the agency. While Miller was not alone in his suspicions, he was one of the few willing to document them. His private file represented a ticking time bomb, a dissenting opinion buried deep within the monolithic consensus of the official investigation. It was a narrative of doubt and defiance, waiting for the day when someone might be willing to listen. The official case was closed, but for Agent Miller, the real investigation had just begun. A lonely pursuit of a truth his own employer was determined to suppress. For over 30 years, the coded notebook seized from Dr. Aris Thorne's cabin remained one of the most impenetrable secrets of the Project Chimera file. Stored in a climate-controlled vault, it was a relic of a bygone era of espionage, filled with a complex cipher that had stumped the NSA's top cryptanalysts in the 1960s. The cipher was not standard military or intelligence grade. It was a bespoke creation, a seemingly chaotic mix of mathematical symbols, astronomical charts, and what appeared to be fragments of an ancient, unknown language. It was Thorne's private lexicon, a keyless lock that held the secrets to his research, and perhaps his disappearance. In the late 1990s, with the advent of advanced computational power and new algorithms for pattern recognition, a clandestine effort was launched to revisit the Thorne notebook. This wasn't an official FBI initiative. Rather, it was a pet project of a small, semi-retired group of NSA graybeards who had cut their teeth on Cold War code-breaking. Working from digitized copies of the pages, they applied brute force attacks and neural network analysis, techniques unimaginable to their predecessors. They were digital ghosts hunting for a pattern in a sea of analog noise, driven by the lingering professional curiosity of a puzzle left unsolved. The process was painstaking. The code seemed to adapt, with the encryption method shifting from one page to the next. It was, as one analyst described it, a living cipher. Initial attempts to find repeating patterns or common letter frequencies, the standard tools of cryptography, failed completely. The team theorized that Thorne had integrated a one-time pad system, but one based not on a random key, but on a dynamic external variable. The prime suspect was the series of star charts scattered throughout the notebook. The team began to suspect the key was not on the page, but in the sky. The positions of celestial bodies on specific dates. This hypothesis required cross-referencing Thorne's notes with astronomical data from the years leading up to his disappearance. It was a monumental task of data alignment. The analysts had to account for everything from sidereal time to the subtle parallax shifts of distant stars. They were no longer just code breakers. They had become astronomers and historians, trying to look at the universe through Aris Thorne's eyes. They were searching for a cosmic key, a specific moment in space and time that would unlock the ravings or revelations of a lost genius. The team felt they were on the precipice of a breakthrough. The correlation of the star charts with the cryptic symbols began to yield non-random outputs, fragmented words and mathematical constants that were too consistent to be coincidental. They were close to hearing Thorne's voice for the first time in decades, but what that voice would say was a source of both excitement and trepidation. They were prying open a box that powerful people had sealed for a reason, and the partial message they were beginning to uncover suggested that reason was more profound than they could have ever imagined. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a sudden flood of information, but a trickle. A single page of the notebook, cross-referenced with the stellar alignment of the night of the vernal equinox in 1962, finally yielded a coherent, albeit fragmented, text. The team of retired analysts stared at the translated sentences on their screen, a message from across the decades that only deepened the enigma. It was not a personal diary entry or a set of weapons schematics. It was something far stranger, a message that seemed to blur the line between theoretical physics and metaphysics. The decoded fragment read, "Sequence is keyed to the resonant frequency. They do not perceive linear time. The invitation is not a place but a vibration. Signal is weak but stable. My device can amplify, but the containment, unstable. The door must be closed from both sides." The text was interspersed with complex equations that modern physicists recognized as related to quantum entanglement and string theory, concepts that were purely theoretical and on the absolute fringe of science in the early 1960s. Thorne was seemingly decades ahead of his time. The implications were staggering. The "they" in the message was an unsettling, undefined presence. The talk of a resonant frequency and an invitation suggested a form of communication, but not with any known terrestrial power. Was Thorne attempting to contact a foreign government with a new technology, or was he reaching for something else entirely? The phrase, "the door must be closed from both sides," was particularly chilling, implying a connection or portal that, once opened, was a two-way street. It recast Thorne not as a victim or a defector, but as a gatekeeper, a man meddling with forces he was struggling to control. This partial message provided a new, terrifying context for the other evidence. The untraceable alloy found in his lab could have been a component of his device. The unusual electromagnetic readings Agent Miller had noted could have been the result of its activation. The entire investigation was suddenly reframed. The FBI's swift and secretive intervention now looked less like a cover-up of a simple disappearance and more like a desperate quarantine protocol. They may not have understood the specifics of Thorne's work, but they understood enough to know it had to be contained at all costs. The decoded page solved nothing, but it changed everything. It transformed the case from a Cold War mystery into something that bordered on science fiction, yet it was grounded in the tangible reality of a government file and a missing scientist. The few who knew of the translation were left with a profound question. Did Aris Thorne succeed in opening a door to somewhere else? And if so, did he go through it willingly, or was he pulled through? The notebook, once a symbol of a dead end, now pointed towards an abyss of possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. To understand why the story of Dr. Aris Thorne was so effectively erased, one must understand the unique psychological climate of the early 1960s. This was an era defined by a precarious balance of technological optimism and existential dread. The space race was in full swing, promising a future among the stars, a testament to human ingenuity. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills under their desks, a constant grim reminder that the same ingenuity could annihilate civilization in a matter of minutes. It was a time of profound cognitive dissonance, where the line between scientific progress and potential apocalypse was razor thin. Within this pressure cooker, the government maintained a tight grip on the public narrative. The ideal scientist was a clean-cut, patriotic figure like the Mercury 7 astronauts, brave, dependable, and working towards a clear national goal. They were symbols of American strength and stability. A figure like Aris Thorne, an eccentric recluse working on fringe theories that he himself could barely articulate, whose research produced bizarre and unexplainable phenomena, was a dangerous anomaly. He did not fit the mold. He represented the unpredictable, chaotic side of science, the very thing the government sought to control. The concept of national security was an all-encompassing justification for secrecy. The public, conditioned by the Cold War, was largely accepting of the idea that some things were simply not for them to know. If the government said a matter was classified, the questions stopped. This culture of deference allowed agencies like the FBI to operate with a level of autonomy that is difficult to imagine today. They could classify a man's entire existence, sanitize a crime scene, and construct a cover story with little fear of being challenged by the press or the public. The disappearance of one scientist, no matter how brilliant, was a small price to pay for maintaining social order and a sense of control. Furthermore, the nature of Thorne's apparent research was itself a threat to the established worldview. The decoded fragments hinted at concepts, interdimensional travel, non-linear time, that sounded more like the pulp science fiction magazines of the day than serious academic pursuits. To even acknowledge such research was to risk widespread panic or ridicule. It was easier for the authorities to bury the case than to try and explain the inexplicable. They chose the path of least resistance, allowing the Thorne mystery to fade into obscurity rather than confronting the uncomfortable truths it might reveal about the universe and our place in it. This deliberate suppression was not born solely of malice, but of a kind of paternalistic fear. The gatekeepers of information believed they were protecting the public from a reality it was not equipped to handle. In their view, the world was a fragile construct, and a story like Aris Thorne's, with its hints of cosmic horrors and uncontrollable forces, was a crack in the foundation. So they papered over the crack, hoping no one would ever notice the darkness that lay beneath. The story was forgotten because it was designed to be forgotten, a casualty of an era that craved certainty more than it valued truth. The disappearance of Dr. Aris Thorne does not exist in a vacuum. When viewed through a wider lens, his case becomes part of a disturbing pattern of strange incidents involving top-tier scientists and engineers throughout the Cold War. These were not simple workplace accidents or defections. They were a series of high-strangeness events that, when considered together, suggest a hidden variable at play. The Thorne case might be the most well-documented thanks to Agent Miller's secret file, but it is far from the only one. These interconnected events create a mosaic of unsolved mysteries that hint at a broader, more clandestine story. Consider the case of Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher who, in 1959, was found dead in his car in Florida, a hosepipe connected to his exhaust. His death was ruled a suicide, but many of his colleagues were skeptical. In the years prior, Jessup had been in correspondence with the Office of Naval Research regarding his theories on unified field theory and its potential application for propulsion, concepts that mirrored the fringe physics Thorne was exploring. Jessup claimed he was on the verge of a major breakthrough, but also reported being followed and feeling immense pressure from unknown parties. His death silenced a prominent voice exploring the exact same scientific territory as Thorne. Then there is the enigma of the GEC Marconi scientists in the United Kingdom during the 1980s. Over a period of several years, nearly 24 scientists and engineers working on highly classified electronic defense projects, many related to the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars, died in a series of bizarre and improbable circumstances. These were ruled as suicides or accidents, but the sheer number and the statistical improbability of so many experts from the same sensitive field meeting untimely ends raised serious questions. Were they casualties of industrial espionage? Or had they, like Thorne, stumbled upon a dangerous truth in their research? These cases, though separated by time and geography, share a common thread. They all involve brilliant minds working at the absolute cutting edge of physics and technology, often in areas with potential military applications. Each case was officially closed with a mundane explanation that seemed to contradict the extraordinary circumstances and the high-stakes nature of their work. It is as if a hidden hand was trimming the branches of scientific inquiry that grew too close to a certain forbidden knowledge. The official reports read like curated fictions, designed to quell curiosity rather than provide genuine answers. Connecting these dots reveals a chilling possibility. Perhaps the force that led to Thorne's disappearance was not an isolated event. It could be that there is a persistent, ongoing phenomenon or agency, either human or otherwise, that monitors and interacts with those who approach a certain threshold of scientific understanding. In this context, the FBI's cover-up in the Thorne case might not have been a singular act of containment, but one small part of a much larger, silent policy. A policy to manage, control, and, when necessary, erase the scientists who fly too close to the sun, leaving behind a trail of unsolved cases and lingering questions. In the initial 1965 investigation, dozens of interviews were conducted, but one was almost immediately dismissed and buried deep within the case file. It was the testimony of a local trapper named Silas Croft, an old man who had lived in the Oregon woods his entire life. Croft claimed that on the night Thorne disappeared, he was checking his lines several miles from the physicist's cabin when he saw something that made him question his own sanity. His statement was deemed unreliable, the ramblings of an isolated old man prone to tall tales. But re-examining his words decades later, in the context of the decoded notebook, lends them a new and disturbing weight. Croft described a silent light descending into the dense forest in the direction of Thorne's property. He was adamant that it was not a helicopter or an airplane. He knew the sounds of all conventional aircraft that flew over those mountains. This was completely silent, and it moved, in his words, like a falling leaf, but with purpose. He said the light was not a beam, but a solid thing, a glowing orb of bluish-white energy that seemed to pulse with a low hum that he felt in his chest more than he heard with his ears. He hid behind a thicket of pine, watching as it settled somewhere beyond his line of sight. A few minutes later, the light ascended just as silently as it had arrived and vanished into the overcast sky. Croft, unnerved, packed up his gear and headed home, deciding not to venture closer. When questioned by the FBI, his simple, honest description of the event was met with condescension and skepticism. The interviewing agent noted in his report that Croft appeared sober but was of a simple disposition, likely mistaking a weather phenomenon or perhaps a meteor for something more elaborate. The testimony was filed away under miscellaneous and uncorroborated, a dead-end lead in a case they were already being pressured to steer in a specific direction. However, if we place Croft's testimony alongside the fragment from Thorne's notebook, the invitation is not a place but a vibration. Signal is weak, but stable. A startling new picture emerges. Could the silent light Croft witnessed have been a physical manifestation of the phenomenon Thorne was trying to contact or control? The trapper's description of a low resonant hum aligns eerily with Thorne's mention of a resonant frequency. Croft may have been the sole accidental witness to the climax of Thorne's experiment the moment the door was opened. This re-evaluation of a dismissed witness statement is a crucial element in many unsolved mysteries. It highlights how initial biases and a rigid investigative framework can cause crucial evidence to be overlooked. The FBI in 1965 was looking for a spy, a kidnapper, or a body. They were not equipped, nor were they permitted, to look for a glowing orb that hummed at a specific frequency. Silas Croft's testimony was not unreliable. It was simply incompatible with the reality the investigators were prepared to accept. He saw exactly what he said he saw, and what he saw might just be the key to the entire mystery. The central unanswered question in the Thorn mystery revolves around the true nature of his work. While his official research for the government contractor he worked for was in advanced radar and signals intelligence, his private notes, particularly the decoded fragments, suggest he was using this as a foundation for something far more ambitious and esoteric. The equations scattered throughout his notebook were not just extensions of known physics, they were leaps into speculative realms that most of his contemporaries would have dismissed as fantasy. He was building a bridge, but the destination remains the case's most profound secret. Based on the available evidence, the notebook, the strange alloy, the electromagnetic anomalies, and Croft's testimony, we can construct a plausible hypothesis. Thorn may have discovered a way to manipulate spacetime on a localized level. His work on signal resonance might have been a search for a specific frequency that could interact with the fabric of reality itself, a concept known in theoretical physics as a brane or extra dimension. The device he mentioned could have been an amplifier designed to generate and focus this frequency, effectively thinning the veil between our dimension and another. This wasn't theoretical work on a chalkboard, it was practical and experimental. The metallic fragment, with its non-terrestrial isotopic ratios, could have been a byproduct of his experiment. Matter that had been briefly passed through this alternate reality and had its fundamental properties altered. The electromagnetic fields he generated were so powerful that they left a detectable residue, the buzzing sensation reported by the initial investigators. Thorn was not just thinking about other dimensions. He was actively knocking on the door, and it appears someone or something answered. The implications of this research for the Cold War era are immense. If the United States could master such technology, it would represent a leap forward far greater than the atomic bomb. The ability to move through space without traversing it, to access other realities, would render all conventional warfare and espionage obsolete. This would explain the extreme secrecy and the immediate, overwhelming response from the highest levels of national security. They weren't just covering up a missing person, they were classifying a fundamental discovery about the nature of the universe. Dr. Thorn's work was a secret too dangerous to exist. His ultimate fate is therefore tied to the success or failure of his final experiment. If he succeeded, he may have stepped through his door willingly, becoming the first human interdimensional explorer. If he failed, the unstable containment he worried about might have collapsed, either destroying him instantly or pulling him into a place from which he could not return. The tragedy of Aris Thorn is that he may have made the single greatest discovery in human history. But the only evidence left behind is his own, cryptic warning and a silence that has now lasted for over half a century. In the modern era, the battle for the truth about Aris Thorn has moved from the Oregon forests to the digital archives and sterile halls of government bureaucracy. A new generation of independent researchers, investigative journalists, and dedicated amateurs are using the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, as their primary tool. They are attempting to pry open the files that were sealed so tightly decades ago, believing that digital records and a more transparent government might finally yield answers. However, they have found that the walls of secrecy built in the 1960s are remarkably resilient. The process is a slow, frustrating war of attrition. Initial FOIA requests for files related to Project Chimera or the disappearance of Aris Thorn are often met with a GLOMAR response, where the agency refuses to even confirm or deny the existence of the records. This is a legal maneuver typically reserved for the most sensitive matters of national security. The fact that it is being applied to a missing persons case from over 50 years ago is in itself highly revealing. It suggests that whatever Thorn was involved in, it is still considered a live and critical secret. When documents are eventually released after years of appeals, they are often rendered almost useless. The pages are a sea of black ink, with entire paragraphs, pages, and even entire sections redacted. Key names, dates, and technical descriptions are blacked out, leaving behind a skeleton of a report filled with prepositions and conjunctions, but devoid of any meaningful content. The message from the government is clear: you can have the file, but you cannot have the information. This excessive redaction serves only to fuel further speculation, confirming for many that a significant cover-up is still in effect. Despite these obstacles, a few crucial details have emerged from the margins of these censored documents. A declassified budget report from a tangential department, for example, might show a payment to a contractor for unusual metallic sample analysis around the time of Thorn's disappearance. A heavily redacted memo might accidentally leave a single name unredacted, allowing researchers to track down a retired agent or scientist who might be willing to speak off the record. It's a form of digital archaeology, sifting through mountains of bureaucratic refuse in the hope of finding a single illuminating artifact. This ongoing struggle for information connects the Thorn mystery directly to contemporary debates about government transparency and overclassification. It raises a fundamental question: at what point does national security become a permanent excuse to hide the past? The men who classified these files are long gone, the Cold War is over, yet the secrecy persists. It implies that the secret of what happened to Eris Thorne is not a historical one. It is a secret that, if revealed, could have implications for the here and now. A truth that the powers that be believe we are still not ready to face. After decades of silence, speculation, and redacted documents, the mystery of Dr. Eris Thorne remains unsolved, branching into several compelling and deeply unsettling theories. Each theory attempts to explain the strange confluence of evidence: the advanced physics, the coded notebook, the witness testimony, and the government's obsessive secrecy. While none can be proven, they represent the logical endpoints of the available information, painting a portrait of a man who stood at the very edge of human understanding and fell into the unknown. The first major theory is that of a successful experiment. In this scenario, Thorne achieved his goal. He opened a gateway to another dimension or a distant point in space-time and crossed over. His disappearance was not a tragedy but a triumph of exploration. The government cover-up, then, was to prevent a global panic and to stop other nations from replicating his work until they could understand and control it themselves. They are not hiding a death, but a discovery. A discovery so profound it would rewrite religion, science, and philosophy. Thorne in this version is a pioneer, a new kind of Columbus who charted a ultimately. The story of Agent Evelyn Reed doesn't conclude. It simply stops. The trail doesn't run cold. It evaporates into the bureaucratic ether of a bygone era. Decades of declassification requests have yielded little more than pages of black ink, redacting names, dates, and entire operational details into oblivion. The official narrative, frozen in time since the late 1950s, remains a monument to institutional silence. The few remaining colleagues who might have offered insight have long since passed away, taking their secrets and suspicions with them. What we are left with is not a puzzle with missing pieces, but an empty frame where a puzzle should be, a void defined only by the questions that surround it. The silence from the Bureau is not passive. It is an active, ongoing statement that some doors are meant to remain permanently closed. The true impact of her disappearance was never measured in headlines or policy changes. It was a quiet tragedy, a personal cataclysm that unfolded in the shadows of the Cold War's grand theater. For her family, it was a wound that never healed, an endless cycle of hope and despair fed by official non-answers. For her colleagues within the cryptology unit, it was a chilling reminder of their own vulnerability and the unseen dangers of their work. It planted a seed of paranoia and mistrust that subtly altered the dynamics of the very department built on secrets. Evelyn Reed's vanishing act served as an unwritten rule, that the system designed to protect the nation could just as easily erase one of its own, without a trace and without apology, a cost of doing business in the high-stakes world of intelligence. This case, though rooted in the past, resonates with an unsettlingly modern frequency. In an age of digital surveillance, data privacy debates, and renewed concerns over the scope of government power, the story of Evelyn Reed is a cautionary tale written in analog. It demonstrates how institutional mechanisms for secrecy, once created, can become self-perpetuating, capable of obscuring not just threats to national security, but also internal failures, crimes, or simple tragic accidents. The tools have changed from locked file cabinets to encrypted servers, but the fundamental conflict between state secrecy and public accountability remains. Her unresolved fate is a historical anchor for the contemporary debate, reminding us that the quest for transparency is a battle that has been waged for generations. Our focus is to bring you these very kinds of stories, the ones that linger in the archives and whisper from the margins of history. We believe in providing historias rápidas, directas e intrigantes, quick, direct, and intriguing stories that challenge what you think you know. We delve into fatos reais que provoquem questionamento, real facts that provoke questioning, offering explicados simples de casos complexos, simple explanations of complex cases to satisfy your curiosity. From Misterios Reais and Casos Now Resolvidos to Curiosidades Históricas and True Crime Soft, we explore the compelling narratives that official records ignore. If this journey into the unknown fascinates you and you want more content that generates immediate curiosity, then become part of our community of investigators. Subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and never miss an exploration into the unexplained. And now, we turn it over to you. After weighing all the evidence, what is your final theory on the disappearance of Agent Evelyn Reed? Was it a foreign power, an internal cleanup, or something else entirely? Leave a comment below with your analysis. Your perspective is a crucial part of keeping these forgotten stories alive for a new generation.